Hi everyone, welcome to today's training webinar on how to plan and strategize and implement a campaign. As you will have read in the accompanying email, this online training webinar will be followed up with a participatory online workshop. At this webinar, you will be able to ask the Secretariat team questions that you may have in relation to the training that's being shared with you today. You will also be able to share your experiences of implementing a campaign. We are, however, particularly interested in learning about the constraints that you face at centre level when implementing a campaign, particularly those in relation to the external environment. In the email, you will also find a set of training materials. This includes the complete version of the strategy that's being shared in part with you today, brief guidance on gender terminology relevant to the case that's being used for today's training, and lastly, there are a couple of in-depth planning tools called a SWOT and a PEST analysis, which have been specifically developed for the case training that you are looking at today. Now, on the next slide, you will see all the areas that we hope you will feel more confident in understanding by the end of this training. This includes the key principles and stages of planning a campaign, understanding what we mean by evidence in the context of campaigning and why it's important, how to identify and devise campaign aims and objectives, how to decide on who you need to target with your campaign and tools you want to use as well as other key elements, and finally, how to keep monitoring and evaluating your campaign through the implementation process. Essentially, how to ensure that your actions are always meeting your specific goals and objectives. Now, whilst we can use chronological steps to help us plan our projects, the truth is, as you start to implement your campaign, you will find things that you hadn't planned for. For example, you may learn about the full extent of a target's hostility to the idea of women's rights, which may throw your objectives completely off course. Or you may discover an ally that you had never anticipated. This is a completely natural and intrinsic part of the learning process. With careful planning, however, we try and manage as many possible contingencies as we can at the planning stage rather than implementation. By planning these planning processes, you are trying to ensure that your campaign is more able to reach its stated aims and objectives. Most importantly, planning provides us an element of control in a world where change is unpredictable, complex, and never linear. So using these tools allows us to understand the problem and possible solution in more manageable chunks. Now, we will move on to the case study. This example focuses on one of the most common forms of gender violations, which specifically and largely is directed at women: rape and sexual assault. Please note that the case study is fabricated and generic. It is designed in such a way that it could take place almost anywhere in the world. This case example has been devised to respond to a situation in which the Centre wants to initiate a thematic campaign to catalyse longer-term structural change rather than advocate on key demands in relation to an individual case. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read through the case itself. I will leave that with you. But I want to bring our attention to particular elements, and more specifically, the gender element of the case that we are focusing on today. Now, of the many things I want to highlight, please take note of the following: that this violation is part of a sustained pattern of attack rather than a sole incident being targeted at female creatives to undermine their agency when exercising their right to freedom of artistic expression. The gender element of this case is not only evident in the violation itself, but is also evident in the role played by the community and the state, who collectively reinforce social norms. So what does this mean? The police taunt the writer when she is trying to register the case because they believe that the writer's actions are self-expression, whether that be through her personal or professional life, invited this attack. So both her dress sense as well as the nature of her writing are both seen to be responsible for other people's actions. Now, this is quite unlike male writers, in which their personal appearance does not largely factor in how the state responds or how people respond to an attack targeted against them. Now, the other thing that you will notice is that official government statements made on the issue of the series of targeted rapes are not unequivocal in their condemnation of the attacks, thereby effectively colluding with the perpetrators. And finally, as a result of the continuing series of assaults and crimes targeting female creatives, writers are starting to self-censor. Now, one of the first stages in assessing what can be done is to break down the problem into manageable parts to help you understand how best to approach it. This means using a series of planning processes which address each crucial phase of the campaign, breaking it down into manageable components for better clarity. Planning also helps to create a shared purpose amongst those who are planning the campaign. It gives clarity on who holds the real power in relation to decision making. It is crucial to have clear evidence also of who makes the decisions. It also captures the complex nature of various interplaying factors, for example, which you may identify in the pest environment, which can sometimes work against each other. Now, in order to engage in this planning process, you will need as much evidence as you can gather in relation to the issue that you want to address. And to do this, you need to engage in an in-depth process called a situational analysis. The situational analysis is one of the most important components of your planning. A situational analysis is literally what the name suggests. By engaging in this process, you will need to find out as much relevant detail as possible to enable you to cope with contingencies and overcome hurdles. It will also allow you to plan smarter. Now, with evidence gathering, this is a continual process that you will continue to refine as you implement your campaign. And as structured as this process is, you will also find that it is cyclical. So, at times, as you continue to monitor the implementation of your campaign, you will find yourself going back over the PEST and the SWOT planning tools and adding in new elements. Now, as we move on to the next slide, situational analysis. There are two initial processes which are part of a situational analysis. These are generally known as a PEST analysis and a SWOT analysis. These parallel tools are used together in all industries, including the business sector, to enable the institution to assess its environment and how it can respond to it in a way which speaks to its strengths. A PEST analysis, in which you outline the political, economic, social, and technological factors in relation to the issue that you are focusing on, helps you to examine the external environment. Now, by adding or looking at this element within your campaign planning, you are able to understand how and whether it is possible to reduce the impact of any negative elements on your campaign. It will also show you what additional specific expert help you may need to plug gaps in your knowledge. A SWOT, on the other hand, is the tool that is used for assessing the internal environment and helps you to identify those internal organizational components that may help you support your response. Now let's focus our attention to the PEST. Generally speaking, the PEST is always done first to be able to identify any concerns which should appear in the SWOT. Now, looking at this PEST diagram, you can see it's been kept really simple for this training. Please be reassured, as I have outlined earlier, that more detail of what the PEST may look like in the context of a campaign on women's rights is provided in your additional training notes. So as I have said earlier, please do look at them as we go through this training to help you. Now, when we look at the PEST diagram provided, you can see, or we can see, that there are a set of generic criteria which should be applied to any campaign that you are planning. The idea is to develop a 360 degrees evidence-based perspective on your focus issue. A pest tends to look at macro issues, at the external macro issues. However, before you embark on the exercise, you will need clear data on the relevant details regarding the pattern or violation that you are focusing on. Now, in this specific case, it would be good to get more evidence and understanding of a few things in relation to what is happening. For example, this may include the police response in this case, but also in others, to identify whether there is a pattern to the type of writer that is being targeted, whether there is any sequence in the pattern of attack, what's the media response or the state response, for example, and many others. Now, when examining the political environment, you may want to take various things into account. For example, you may know from reading the newspapers that there is growing political pushback on women's rights, in which the political party in power are very vocal in stating their opposition to any progressive agenda. And if we continue looking at the political environment, we can see that the government is reducing the power of various institutions so that the normal democratic checks and balances are not working. This includes regulatory bodies such as the National Human Rights Commission, which have seen under this government their powers reduced. Now, when you're looking at the pest environment, of the political environment, you will also want to look at any relevant government policies, and in this case those on women's rights, including looking at who is heading relevant key departments and what their position on women's rights is. In your political element of your pest, you will also want to look at the state response. That includes any public statements made by individuals in their official capacity, as well as the police response to the rapes. You may also want to identify any domestic lobbying groups or pressure groups for potential collaboration, because as we know, strengthening your public voice also relies on many different voices who come together on one central message. It's also helpful perhaps for you to look at the demographics. In this case, you may want to look at the situation vis-a-vis women's rights more generally. You may also want to include other factors to this pest. The key to using this tool is to make it your tool, in which you can adapt it to fit your needs and assess the external environment in the way most suited to your campaign and your locality. Now, in terms of your research on the political environment, you can refer to a number of different sources to fill in your pest or the political element of your pest. You can read papers, you can look at relevant NGO reports, you can speak to experts, and if you do require any more assistance on this, please do feel free to email me. Now, in the economic part of the analysis, you may want to assess the relevant funding policies or practices which significantly undermine, for example, freedom of expression. You may also think that it's worthwhile looking at any restrictions on international funding to women's groups or those groups supporting freedom of expression. It may also look or be useful to you to look at relevant economic trends. For example, is there a downturn in the economy? Could this suggest perhaps that the government is trying to use a distraction to turn public attention to other issues? You may also want to examine the socioeconomic context of the victim and other creatives who are being targeted. Now, when we look at the social environment, we are essentially looking at social and cultural norms. You will need to try and get a sense of public opinion, more generally to understand why the state is responding to the manner that it is to the series of rapes. You may want to examine in more detail, for example, the role of the religious clergy in swaying contemporary public opinion on women's rights. Now, as we move on to technological, you will also want to look at any relevant legislation which impacts the online sphere and is relevant to your issue. For example, if individuals are targeted online, you may want to examine the kinds of threats that the women have received and the social media platform response to threats, if at all there has been any. And underneath the legal element, which is one of the elements not included in most pests, but for NGOs it is general practice to do so, you will want to look at perhaps the gaps in law and policy which adversely or positively respond to rape and sexual assault. Now, for this element or any element of your campaign planning, if you need specialist advice, this is a good point at which you can identify the types of people that you need to be speaking to. And as I have said, if you need any further assistance in this initial planning component, then please feel free to email me. Now, in the pest which has been sent in the additional training materials, if you could look at this analysis, you will see that one of the things that we have tried to do once you have analysed your pest is to rate each one of the factors that you have listed using an index to assess the extent of its impact on your campaign. And these are very simple indicators. You can have H for high, M for medium, and L to indicate low. But you will want to look at this analysis and very closely assess what the impact of that factor will be on your campaign and in determining its success. You will also need to review your centre's ability to respond to these challenges. And you can, at this point, once you have finalised your pest, and as I have said, it is a continuing, evolving process, you can move on to what is called a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Now, at first appearances, it can seem that the SWOT and the pest are the same thing. However, I assure you they are not. One refers to the external environment and the other to the internal. You can also use your pest to reflect on particular challenges that may pose a threat to your campaign. Generally speaking, the pest and the SWOT can take at least half a day, also for you to feel completely confident that you have covered all the necessary issues. But please let me reassure you, it is time well spent, and it is crucial to ensure that your evidence-based is as detailed as possible. Now, if we are looking at our SWOT, and if you see here, we have included some basic criteria that you need to use to identify the internal organisational issues which may undermine or strengthen your ability to meet your aims. Under strengths, for example, these are, in other words, things over which we have control. You will want to identify any factors which capitalise your leverage. For example, in the context of the campaign, we know that we have the Women's Rights Manifesto, which clearly indicates our mission on women's rights. We can use this to our advantage as a reference point for our work to demonstrate that we are committed and are consistent in our intention and attention to address women's rights violations wherever they take place in the world. In the second box along, you will see a box focusing on internal weaknesses. Now, these are the negative factors that you want to mitigate or eliminate and may have a negative effect on your campaign if they are not managed appropriately. For example, a weakness in the context of our case could be the lack of an organisational policy to combat gender violence, which external critics could use to suggest that we are being hypocritical and could undermine our public credibility in speaking up on this case. Now, as we move on to opportunities, these are normally defined as those potential factors which should or could be pursued in the context of our strategy and also provide us leverage. For example, one factor that we know is that the state receives a considerable amount of funds from donors for women's rights work, some of whom we are already in contact with and have a good, trustworthy and working relationship with. And finally, in terms of threats, when you're looking at threats, you can look at, for example, publishers' opinions. For example, are publishers pulling out of potential deals with any controversial content written by women? And how would this organisationally have an impact on PEN and its campaign? Maybe because we have historical institutional relationships with some of the same publishers. Now, Having done our PEST and SWOT, and if you want to, you can also look at the PEST and SWOT provided to you in the additional training notes, what we will see are a number of different converging factors which help us in our analysis and in putting our aims and objectives together. Firstly, we know that the pattern of violence against women is escalating. From our analysis, we can see that non-state actors feel that they have impunity to commit these violent acts without being faced with criminal prosecution. We have also managed through this analysis to understand that the wider political context is also becoming more hostile to women's rights and any progressive agenda. And we can see that this is being driven in part by politicians, and that the political party in power, as well as growing popular religious conservatism across the voting spectrum, is having an impact on the women's rights agenda. From this analysis, we may also be able to see that all democratic institutions which could potentially hold the government to account have systematically been eroded by the government. But we can also see that the government receives a lot of grant aid from bilateral and multilateral donors for work on women's rights. Perhaps we can see that the government are trying to straddle the domestic political position in which they want to appease their political vote bank, which is increasingly conservative, with their international reputation, in which they want to appear like they are respectful of women's rights. And from your analysis, you may also find that the government doesn't want these funds to be rescinded or called back, and has to make concessions to international donors at some level to keep a hold of this money. And we can see from our analysis that the Penn Centre is known to be credible and has a good reputation. Your analysis would have also thrown up the reality that we know that there is no point in trying to convince or engage with the community or the family of the rape victim, as traditionally women's groups do not have an established link within the community. Now, we know that on their own, even if we achieve it, that progress in criminal investigations is not enough to restore a sense of safety amongst creatives. We also know that we need to create an atmosphere in which women's writers and civil society more generally still feel able to speak up in response to any further attacks, and for them to keep on creating without fear. Now, in this context and asking these questions and having all of this analysis, we can try and understand the complexity. And by understanding some of this complexity, we also need to ask the question about what is needed to have long-lasting change. Now, when you are thinking of setting your campaign objectives, you will see that you will want to be thinking about a number of different factors. First of all, the kind of campaign that you want to and can focus on, the kinds of time and resources that you have, whether the problem is one of policy, discrimination, embedded in law and policy, or is this about societal change? What needs to change in this context? Do you need to do human rights awareness? That women are also free to exercise their right to freedom of expression? Essentially, where do you want to spend your time? Now, once you have answered these questions with all the information that you have at hand through the analysis that you have done, you can start to think about formulating your aims. Now, for example, we could be thinking our campaign is to end rape or violence against women. And when we look at this and when we unpack these objectives, we come closer to understanding that these are not what we would call smart objectives, but this is a vision that we want of the world. This is the world that we want to live in. And so we have to take this into account and to start using what are called smart objective frameworks to be able to identify objectives which are succinct, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Now, you will notice that all three objectives listed in the campaign strategy, which were sent to you, and are based on all the information that we have analysed so far, are targeted at challenging the impunity perpetrators enjoy. And what we are trying to do is reinstill a sense of safety amongst female writers. So, when we put all of this information together and thinking about the kind of change that we can make and the resources that we have and the kind of time that we have, we can think about what we can do in this context and for the sake of this presentation, I've summarised it down to 3. First of all, we want to press for progress in criminal investigations and criminal prosecutions of alleged perpetrators. Secondly, we want to provide practical guidance and emotional support to writers so that they know how to identify that they may be in danger and where to go in the event of possible attack. And thirdly, what we want to do is to have an awareness-raising element so that writers internationally are able to publicise what is happening and lobby on our behalf. Now, if we turn to the SMART objective and we start to look at what one objective may look like in the context of our campaign, then we can look at the first one, which is about tackling judicial barriers that women may have been facing or have been facing when pushing for investigations into the rape. For example, therefore, what we may want to do is extract a clear commitment over the next 6 months from the Department of Home Affairs and Department of Women, who are primarily responsible for engaging with donors. The commitment is to get them to agree to ensure that whenever rape takes place against anyone exercising their right to freedom of expression, that it will uphold its constitutional norms and implement the rule of the law. Now you may ask, why is this objective SMART? Now, first of all, it is very clear on who it wants this commitment from. It's also very clear about the time period over which we will press for this objective. It's very clear what we want them to do. And we believe that it can be realistic if we find the right people to apply pressure on our campaign points. Now, when framing the objective, it is generally good practice to be able to summarise what you want to do into 1 or 2 sentences. And by doing so, what it means is that you're forced to keep your strategy thinking simple and achievable. Now, if we come back to briefly the point about evidence building, as you proceed in strategizing your approach, you will find that your strategy will constantly be evolving as you find out more about your targets or your external environment, or some new change or new law may have been introduced. For example, having identified that there may be potential leverage through grant programs, you realise that actually you don't have all the research on the influence or more information on the nature of grant being provided. So refining your knowledge base is always going to be an ongoing process through your planning process. And the beauty of doing this, it means that you can always refine your plan before it is implemented. The truth is, you will probably do this several times before you implement your campaign. By the time you are actually able to implement your campaign, you will or should be able to have absolute clarity about what it is you are intending to do. Now let's move to the stakeholder analysis and campaign targets and channels of influence. Now, when you start to think about your objective and what you want to do, you need to think about who you need to target and who you need to get on your side to put pressure on these targets, and what you need to do to help them apply this pressure. Now, in this case, we know that if we want to push criminal investigations, we need to direct our campaigning and lobbying initiatives at the government. In this case, we need decision makers. So therefore, in our case, this includes those ministers or senior government officials who are responsible for implementing women's rights. But it also may extend to those within the government who have either made pro-human rights statements or handled the human rights brief. In terms of our channels of influence, we can see that these are people that we need to approach to put pressure on our targets. Before we can understand or assess how we're going to proceed with reaching our aims, we need to chalk out who is able to help us achieve our objective. Now, in order to do this, what we normally conduct is what is called a stakeholder analysis. Now, if we move on to the next slide, what we will see is that a stakeholder mapping or analysis is the process of identifying parties who are our targets and can influence our targets. We need to understand their interests, possible impacts and influences in the way in which they interact between themselves or within the process that you are instigating. For example, we would want to know their knowledge and initial opinion about the issue that we are dealing with. We would want to know their connection with the issue, what impact could they have, their personal attitudes and professional behaviour, and to understand each stakeholder's relationship to the problem and your proposed solution. But equally crucial to this process is understanding the relationships between the different stakeholders and determine the ability and willingness of stakeholders to engage in pressing your campaign, or those who are intent on preventing your campaign objectives from succeeding. When you have answered these questions and done all the necessary homework, you can start plotting this information in various ways. Now, if we move on to the stakeholder mapping table or a matrix, you will see that we have here a range of variables at the very top which go horizontally that we want to assess and what we want to understand in relation to our end targets and influences. Now, once we have clarity about this process and about our targets and influences, we can identify where and on whom we want to focus our energies. And once you've gone through this process, you can also use a stakeholder graph. And in this, you can try and assess or think about where your stakeholders might be and where you want them to be in relation to the issue that you are trying to measure. We can see from this graph, for example, that bilateral donors have high stakes in how the government responds to the rapes, because they give vast amounts of money to the government on women's rights and they have a high level of influence because the government wants to retain these funds. Now, ideally, when you have analysed the situation, you could use all the information you had at hand to plot a number of stories of change to see how various scenarios might play out. If you do want to do this and you need additional help, again, please feel free to email me on the email address that will be provided to you at the end of this training webinar. Now, as you unpack your objectives and identify the various stakeholders, you will need to return to your situational analysis to identify how to achieve what you have set out to achieve. Now, once you identify the channels of influence and you want to refine your thinking, you should go back to thinking about your targets. For example, we may know that the other political parties do not have leverage to lobby their parliamentarians on this issue, as they do not have a consistent record on women's rights themselves, and can be accused of hypocrisy. We know that there are no domestic bodies on which we can put adequate pressure to hold the government to account. We also know that the government has been talking about domestic democratic systems as providing a sufficient response to the series of rapes. But we know in real terms that this is just a ruse. In this context, from our stakeholder analysis, we can see that donors have considerable impact on the government, grant huge amounts of money, and as we know, the government is unwilling for these funds to be recalled. We know, for example, that our centres are based in those countries where most of this money is sent, and in some cases the centres have good working relationships with the funder. So given that it makes sense to target donors, given the fact that we know that they have high impact and high influence, we need to look at how we want to do this. Now the question is, do we want to target all donors? And of course the answer is no. It would simply be a waste of our time and resources to do so. So we need to decide on some criteria. In our case, it could be that we identify those donors who focus on women's rights. We identify those donors who provide bilateral or multilateral aid, those who have good working relationships with the government and put pressure on them using a human rights lens in their approach, in which they are also talking about the importance of freedom of expression without discrimination. We may also want to target those who provide a certain number of funds. So you can think about defining how much money that you believe that you need to be targeting, which donors you need to be targeting on that basis. And you can also look at donor messaging on women's rights and to see whether it is progressive. Now, once you've identified who you're going to target, you will need to identify tools to help you approach these groups. For example, as you try to do this process of identifying those who you're going to approach, and in the process of identifying tools, it may be helpful to use the following tool. Now, when we're looking at this image, we can see that we have created a list of stakeholders, allies and otherwise, who we need to put together or regroup as such and identify the range of tools that would work for that specific group. For example, under allies, you can see that we have a range of different allies there. Those who would support the campaign and stand to gain something for the campaign. We can also see that there are influencers and that we need to put appropriate pressure on our targets. And we can see those who will try to actively interfere with your campaign. And so what you may want to do in this process is look at the different types of tools that you need to produce for each type of each target group that you have. And by doing so, what you will be able to see is whether you're simply producing too many resources for one group and not enough for another, whether you have an adequate budget to do all the various things that you are thinking of. Now, as we move on to the next slide with these wonderful post-it notes, you will see that there are a huge array of tools to choose from. Those that are most successful are the ones that naturally align and fit with the influencer's day and likes, hobbies, how they engage with the world, what's important to them and what's on their mandate. So there's no point, for example, in trying to create a heavily social media campaign for your influencers if they don't use social media. The best tools are those that respond to your stakeholder and not to what you are trying to do. As they say, do not try and drag a horse to water. The tool that you are trying to create should be a natural extension of the person who you are trying to influence to advocate on your behalf. Now, I won't go through the list that we have below here. I'll leave that to you to look at after the training is over. But what I want to do is just regroup again for a second here on approaching donors. And when you have put all this information together, what do you do? Now you know that to enable donors that you have identified that provide the right amount of money and work on women's rights in a progressive way, to get them to help to put pressure on the government authorities, you need to provide them a set of specific tools to help them put the appropriate pressure. So first of all, what you may want to do on the back of the criteria that we have identified is do some research of your own on donors' grant making, how much money they send, etc. So you have clarity on the donor's mandate and how best to approach them. Secondly, you may find it useful to put together some kind of backgrounder or briefing which sets out the issue and the key messages and a request on what you want them to do. And you may also find that you want to, in this instance, have an in-person meeting to run through your key concerns, outlining, for example, why their action matters and why donor aid should be, in this context, conditional on meeting these certain key demands. And in this context, what you also might find very useful is to be very, very clear about what your demands are, about what your actions are, and keeping them very simple and keeping them very few. So think about the topmost demands that you have in this context. Now, when you're thinking through your presentation of arguments to the donor, who may not be fully convinced about why they should be pressing on this issue, you will need to prepare and think about counter-arguments. And looking at counter-arguments is also really important in the context of looking at how the government might respond to your campaign and how you will counter the arguments that they are making. Now, as we finally move on to the next slide and the last slide, we will need to look at preparations for our campaign. We will need to think about the campaign launch date. What's the date? Where will we get most traction in the media and otherwise? We will need to think about putting together a campaigning calendar. And in putting that calendar together, what you can do is highlight key times within the campaign. This will help to identify those times in the campaign when the campaign may feel like it is slowing down and when you may want to give it a fresh lease of life to get the issues back on the news agenda again. By doing this process, you will see if you are trying to do too much or have a similar set of resources targeting the same audiences. It is also essential to have a table to highlight the tools that you are wanting to produce to address or assess the budgetary implications. Now, as we move on to campaign messaging, you have to be clear that all the campaign messaging needs to be consistent no matter what's being produced, whether it be the briefings, whether it be any adverts that are being done, posters, any external material. And our campaign language, when campaigning on women's rights issues, needs to be neutral and non-judgmental. For example, if a woman decides not to file a case with the police, if we see that there are some rumours, for example, about her sexual activity in her personal life, our writing up of her case should not be non-judgmental. We should try and ensure that we are protecting the right to freedom of expression irrespective of gender, sexual activity, sexual orientation, age, race, class, unless the author's writing is, of course, intended to incite violence or cause harm. Our messaging should not reinforce any stereotypes about perceptions of how women should act or not. It is also crucial not to over-communicate the issue. We want to give people a clear understanding of the context in which these violations are taking place, but without complicating the message. And we want to choose a simple campaign title which conveys the nature of your campaigning. It is always better to do this through a brainstorming process with your friends and colleagues who are taking part of the campaign. And finally, please note that the campaign evaluations are very essential in the context of putting together a campaign. And this is in part the constant tinkering that you do that will happen during the course of implementation of your campaign. It is the new information that refines your thinking about what you need to be doing, or refines your objective because you learn more about the target audience. When implementing your campaign, you must continue to do as much as you can to monitor all the activities to ensure that they are continuing to achieve your aims and objectives. You should try and find ways of getting feedback, of monitoring developments, which they easily lend themselves to explanation. For example, if you have greater clarity as to the hurdles, then you should try to incorporate this information in terms of your objectives or your tools. So now, hopefully, you will have greater clarity on the process of campaigning. But undoubtedly, there will be questions. So please do take a note of them in advance of our training webinar conversation, which is happening in a few days, where the team will be trying their utmost to answer those questions for you. We urge you also to send them in advance to help us plan the workshop as efficiently and effectively as we can, and to get through all the very many different questions that you may have. Now, I wanted to say thank you for watching, and just to say that you already should have my email ID, but if you don't, this last slide will give you my email address, and I really do look forward to answering any questions that you have. Please, like I said, no question is too small or too big. The idea is that to really help boost your campaigning voice at local level and your advocacy that you do at the centre level. So thank you very much, and I really do look forward to seeing you very soon. Take care.